On the early evening of May 7, 2008, in the small town of Kosevo in southeast Europe, a 65-year-old woman named Zvezda Temelkovska was doing housework in the kitchen of her apartment. Kosevo is a quiet place in North Macedonia at the foot of Mount Bistra. Although it was a beautiful town, it was remote and not much of note happened there. Kosevo had about 23,000 inhabitants. Zvezda made her living cleaning houses, but she had the day off, so she was cooking dinner, washing clothes, and cleaning her own house while waiting for the return of her adult son named Zoran. Amid the hustle and bustle of housework, Zvezda heard the phone ring in the hallway. She picked up the receiver and heard the voice of her friend on the other end of the line, but the voice sounded strangely tense and confused. The friend asked Zvezda if she had heard the latest news. After she denied this, the woman told her that the radio had just reported a terrible traffic accident in their town. Unfortunately, Zvezda's son Zoran, whom she was expecting at home, was apparently involved in the accident. When Zvezda heard this, she let out a strangled cry, hung up the phone, and ran out the door. A neighbor she met asked what had happened. The agitated woman screamed that her son had had an accident and she was on her way to the hospital. Then she turned the corner and disappeared. Zvezda didn't have her own car, so she was ready to go to the clinic to make sure her son was okay. A little later, the same neighbor who had seen Zvezda turn the corner heard a knock at the door. She opened the door and was completely shocked to see who was standing in front of it. It was Zvezda's son Zoran, in perfect health. The man did not seem in the least injured. He looked clearly embarrassed and, before the neighbor could ask questions, he asked if the woman had seen his mother. They had arranged to have dinner together, but for some reason she was not home. Zvezda had not warned her son that she would leave, and that was not her way. The neighbor didn't understand anything either. She told Zoran that she had seen his mother rush to the hospital and casually mentioned that her son had had a car accident. Zoran was as confused as the neighbor, so he took out his phone and called the clinic to see if his mother was there. The receptionist's message surprised him very much. First, Zvezda had not shown up there. Second, they had also heard the report of a serious car accident in the city, but none of the injured had been brought to them. The next morning, when Zvezda still hadn't shown up and Zoran had no idea what had happened to his mother, he went to the police and filed a missing persons report. 9 days later, on May 16, Zvezda Temelkovska was still missing, and her son Zoran had no idea where to look for her. However, her body had already been discovered. This information had not yet been made public because the body was badly mutilated, wrapped in plastic wrap, tied with wire, and dumped in an illegal landfill near the city's soccer stadium. Additionally, the woman had been abused with various objects. However, the police's initial investigations revealed that the deceased was a poor elderly cleaning woman who had no enemies. The investigators could not understand why she became the victim of such a brutally obvious and intimate crime. Later that day, a 56-year-old reporter named Vlado Taneski, who lived near the house of the missing woman, received the news. He received a call from one of his informants at the police station who told him that Zvezda had just been found, and unfortunately, the woman was dead. The informant told Vlado that during a search of the body, her valuables were found with the victim. So the version of a botched robbery was immediately ruled out. Taneski thanked his informant for the information and leaned back in his chair to gather his thoughts. Vlado, unlike his informant, was not so shocked but suspected something was wrong. He felt that something didn't add up. Perhaps Zvezda really did seem like a poor elderly cleaning lady with no enemies, but in reality, this woman might have been leading some kind of secret life, which is why she was attacked. Or she had stumbled upon something she wasn't supposed to see, and that was why she was killed. The reporter felt that he had to get involved in this investigation. Vlado Tedeschi had a reputation in the city as a very professional, aggressive, and fearless reporter. He had no problem diving headfirst into tangled dark stories that might involve corruption or abuse of power, and always got to the bottom of things. Again and again, he published articles in which he criticized the government, the police, and anyone in power. Because Vlado had behaved this way throughout his 30-year career, he received many death threats. Although the story about the death of Zivana Timilkowska could once again embarrass him before the authorities, he felt it was his duty to investigate the case and get to the bottom of it. Determined, Vlado grabbed his notebook and pen and went out the door. He made his way to the house of the dead woman to speak with her son. Just a few minutes later, Vlado and Zoran were sitting in the kitchen, talking about what had happened. The man told the reporter how he had come home that evening and not found his mother. While Zoran was talking, Vlado took many notes and asked many additional questions. By the end of the conversation, the reporter had already put the facts together in his mind and realized that he had a pretty good theory about what had actually happened to Zivana. The reason for this was that Zoran's mother made her living cleaning other people's houses. Vlado needed a few days to piece together the whole story. He had to go out and interview dozens of people in the neighborhood. Finally, on May 19, just 3 days after Zivana's death, Vlado Tedeschi published a sensational headline in the newspaper: "A serial killer lurks in Kosevo too." In the article, Vlado wrote that the gruesome death of Zivana Timilkowska was probably not an isolated case. It was connected to the deaths of 2 other victims. All 3 women had a similar appearance and age and worked as cleaners. This is why, during the conversation with Zoran, when he described his mother, how she looked, and what she did, Vlado remembered the other 2 victims and put all the facts together, finding the following similarities. One of the victims was 64-year-old Mitra Simeonowska, who disappeared in November 2004 while shopping at a supermarket. Her body was discovered only in January of the following year. The elderly woman was found wrapped in a plastic bag. She was wearing only a dark sweater. Additionally, she was forced into sexual intercourse, beaten, and strangled with a telephone cable. The pathologist determined that Mitra had been dead for several months when the body was found. The other victim was 56-year-old Lubita Likowska, who was murdered in November 2007. Her body was found in an abandoned landfill in the woods. She was abused, and the perpetrator also used a telephone cable. He dismembered her body and disposed of it in black garbage bags. Vlado's story was shocking information for the residents of the small town, who learned that a serial killer was roaming their quiet streets. The article was also scandalous because the author once again criticized the police involved in these investigations. 2 young men who were already under investigation were accused of the first crime, but their involvement could not be proven. The second incident occurred when the 2 suspects were already behind bars, making their involvement doubtful. The police officers reacted skeptically to the criticism directed at them but couldn't help recognizing that Vlado had managed to uncover many new details in the 3 cases, and it indeed painted the picture of a serial killer who linked all 3 cases together. So, the police essentially began investigating a new case based on Vlado's story, connecting the deaths of the 3 cleaners. At the same time, the reporter noticed that he was being followed. Whatever he did in the city, whether he spoke with witnesses or searched for new information for his articles, there had to be a policeman somewhere watching him from a distance. Tedeschi suspected that his outburst against the police would not go unnoticed and that he would inevitably face some kind of backlash from the police. The reporter had come to terms with the fact that he would be watched and that they might try to intimidate him, but that didn't bother him because he was doing his job, and his story was true and based on facts. In early June, about 2 weeks after Zivana Timilkowska's body was found, the police had narrowed down the circle of suspects to just 3 people. Originally, there had been hundreds. They believed they were close to finding and arresting the potential perpetrator. The surveillance of the journalist continued, but the authorities never publicly discussed the case of the serial killer in the small town of Kosevo and said nothing about it. It got to the point that all 3 cases were published in the Criminal Chronicle of various publications in Macedonia. Vlado's notes served their purpose. The locals began to suspect that Vlado was right in his judgment about the poor work of the investigators. On June 20, 2008, the editor of the newspaper where Vlado worked received a call from a police officer with the confidential information that the authorities were about to make an arrest in the case of the triple murder of elderly cleaning women. Immediately after the call, the editor called Vlado to inform him of this news. However, Vlado did not answer the phone, which was very strange. Even more surprising for the editor was that the officer had called him and not the man who had actually pushed the authorities to further investigate. Apparently, the criticism of them had struck a nerve, and the police had deliberately ignored the scandalous reporter. While contemplating this, the editor kept calling Vlado, but he still did not answer the phone. The newspaper staff assumed that Vlado had somehow learned about the impending arrest and was already on site to follow the police action in real time. At that moment, the police surrounded a very modest 2-story house on a quiet street in Kosevo, whose facade was heavily overgrown with bushes and tall trees. All the windows of the building were covered with heavy curtains, and there was silence inside. With all escape routes blocked, the task force climbed onto the stone porch, knocked cautiously on the door, and announced that they were the police. Everyone in the house was ordered to come out with their hands up. For a moment, there was complete silence and tension. Then, the officers on the porch heard slow footsteps inside the house. They had their weapons ready as the door slowly opened. The man who appeared in the doorway looked completely harmless and a little confused, obviously not sure what was going on. The officers immediately arrested him, put him in a patrol car, and took him to the station. During the search of the suspect's home, the investigators found an impressive collection of erotic films with explicit violent scenes. This was another warning signal, considering the crime he was suspected of. Shortly after, the phone in the newspaper's editorial office rang again. It was the same police officer who had warned of the impending arrest, only this time he said that the arrest had indeed taken place and that they had finally caught the perpetrator of a series of serious crimes in the town. Then he gave the editor the name of the arrested person. When the newspaper staff heard the name, they dropped the receiver in shock. The serial killer turned out to be Vlado Tedeschi, a well-known reporter. Outwardly, the reporter seemed very reserved and calm, but inside, he was full of anger towards all the people around him, especially his mother. When he was arrested, the man was calm, perhaps still hoping that it was a mistake. At the police station, he mostly remained silent, then denied knowing the 3 murdered women at all. He behaved restrainedly, without aggression or remorse. The investigators even suspected that Tedeschi had intended to get caught at some point. The reporter realized that such candid descriptions and details of the crimes would sooner or later cast doubt on him. How could he know what even the investigators didn't know? For many people who knew Vlado closely, he seemed reserved and introverted, but such characteristics did not make him a criminal. Therefore, everyone was shocked when it turned out that the journalist was precisely the serial killer he had so vividly reported on in his exposé articles. Vlado Tedeschi was born in 1952 in the town of Kosevo. He had an older brother and a younger sister. The family was never wealthy and lived quite modestly. if not poorly. The parents raised their children strictly and made them put all their energy into education. The boy studied well, was quiet and inconspicuous, but deep inside, he dreamed of fame and recognition. After graduating from school, young Vlado went to Croatia to become a journalist. There, he felt free because the relationship with his father and mother was not particularly good. When he turned 21, he met a girl named Vesna. They soon married, and Vlado became the father of 2 children. The couple had similar interests, and the children brought them even closer together. His wife spoke of him as a wonderful father and husband. The talent of the young journalist began to gradually unfold, and by the mid-1980s, he was working as a reporter for the newspapers Nova Macedonia and Jutrinski Vesnik. Colleagues considered him a professional and spoke kindly of him. For the authorities, however, the man was a thorn in the side. Vlado had great success in his career and became popular throughout the country. In Macedonia, he even received several awards for his professionalism. The crime stories in his articles took on an even darker tone, which drew attention and interest from readers to his column. He was willing to do anything to become famous and gain respect in the industry. To this end, Vlado chose topics that would leave no reader indifferent. The problem was that sensations did not occur every day. He resorted to forbidden methods and created sensations on his own. In 2003, Tedeschi was forced to give up his position in the newsroom. A tragedy occurred in his family, after which he withdrew and became depressed. He began to miss work and wander around the city, which led to financial difficulties and a deterioration in his relationship with his wife, and Vlado was fired. His wife took his place. Due to a violation of work discipline, the man was offered to become a freelance correspondent. Shortly thereafter, Vesna Tedeschi was promoted, took her children, and moved to Skopje, the capital of North Macedonia. Vlado was left alone with his tragedy and anxious thoughts. The fact is that Vlado's father, Slobodan Tedeschi, was a World War II veteran, while his mother, Anton, worked as a simple cleaning lady. There is no exact information about the motive, but in 2002, his parents committed suicide. His father hanged himself, and his mother poisoned herself with pills. Due to these events, Vlado's life turned upside down overnight. The man blamed his own mother for all his problems, portraying her as a cruel tyrant with a terrible character. According to available data, the woman treated her son very poorly in childhood, beating and humiliating him. It is possible that the relationship with his mother had a strong influence on the perpetrator's psyche. Since it was impossible to take revenge on his deceased mother, Vlado became obsessed with the idea of deciding the fate of people who resembled her. He randomly chose women who worked as cleaning ladies, all around the same age and appearance, plump, smiling brunettes with a kind-hearted look. 3 of Vlado's victims were Mitra Simeonowska in 2004, Lubita Likowska in 2007, and Zavana Timilkowska in 2008. All these women knew Vlado's mother personally. Therefore, he used this connection to gain the trust of each of them. Initially, he studied their work schedules, followed them, and chose the right moment to attack. When the right moment came, Vlado lured the victims onto the street, followed them into a dark alley, and took them to an unknown location with the help of his personal acquaintance. After the murder, Vlado usually visited the homes of the victims' relatives under the pretext of wanting to find out details about the disappearance of the women. He expressed his condolences and asked them to tell him how they were doing when they were still alive. He later used the information he obtained in his articles. All 3 women were found half-naked in black plastic bags, obviously abused, beaten, and strangled with a telephone cable. DNA was found on the body of one of the victims, but no matches were found in the database. In his revealing article, Valado lied about a number of pieces of evidence to confuse the police. For example, he mentioned a witness who allegedly saw Zavana get into a car with two men before her disappearance. Valado was also the one who reported on the radio that Soren Timolkowski was involved in a terrible car accident. At that moment, the woman, in her desperation, ran out of the apartment. At that moment, she could believe anything she was told, and that was exactly what Valado wanted. He personally called the news editor and told him about the car accident. Since Valado had previously worked at the radio station, they believed him and did not check the facts but simply aired the news. In reality, it was all a deliberate trap by Valado to lure Zavana out of the apartment. Finally, he was caught referring to certain details in his articles that the police had withheld from the public. This happened when the police had not yet even received the results of the autopsy. Such details could only be known to the eyewitness, the victim, or the perpetrator. For example, Valado mentioned that Zavana was strangled with a telephone cable and the body bag was tied with the same cable. These details only came to light after the forensic examination. So, the article was ahead of the investigation. Valado described the atrocity so vividly that it was frightening to imagine him being there. A telephone cable was also used with the other two victims, which was later left at the crime scene, but this information was also not available to the public. After Valado's story appeared in the newspaper, law enforcement agencies had serious suspicions against the reporter. How else could he have known such details about the incident, when Valado thought the police were only following him to intimidate him? They suspected him of being involved in the crimes. Finally, they managed to obtain a DNA sample from the scandal-ridden journalist and compare it with that of one of the victims. Their worst fears were confirmed. The famous crime reporter turned out to be a serial killer who murdered elderly women. Immediately after his arrest, Valado was charged with 3 crimes. Moreover, investigators suspected there were more crimes. The wanted list also included 78-year-old Gorica Polewski, who had been missing since 2003. The police suspected she might also have been a victim of Valado. Unfortunately, the elderly woman's body was never found, so no evidence of involvement in the crime was found. To the disappointment of everyone, this man never received the punishment he deserved. On June 23, just 3 days after his arrest, Valado died in his prison cell at the Titovo Detention Center, taking the secret of his actions to the grave. The exact motive for his crimes remained a mystery to the investigators. It is presumed that the man drowned himself in a small plastic bucket, as water was found in his lungs. He was 56 years old at the time of his death. 3 other people were in the room with him. They reported that they did not notice how it happened as they were sleeping at the time and heard nothing. The investigation into Valado's death went cold. The way Valado ended his life left the public horrified. Neighbors, colleagues, and acquaintances all agreed that they could not imagine Valado as a madman. In their opinion, the man who advocated for the interests of the residents of Kosevo could not have taken the lives of elderly women. He might have been a reserved and uncommunicative person, but he had a good upbringing. Officially, Valado Taneski's death was recognized as suicide, and the case was closed. The media continued to discuss the crimes committed by this man for a long time. He even received several nicknames: the Macedonian Jack the Ripper, the Grandmother Hunter, and the Crazy Journalist. Thus, Macedonia had a second serial killer. Thank you for watching and take care of yourselves. Sometimes a random coincidence of circumstances leads to the death of a person. It seemed as though a cruel fate had taken a loving mother from her children and a faithful wife from her husband, but there were too many strange coincidences. As the police officers in Denver are used to knowing, coincidences are too suspicious when it comes to death. So they began an investigation that would take years to conclude. The 44-year-old mother and wife was found in her own bathtub. At first glance, it looked like she had simply passed out and suffocated. The woman died without an apparent reason, and there were no signs of an attack. This happened in March 2015, and the case became a challenging task for the police, as there were few clues and almost no traces. The investigation began to consider several scenarios at once. One of them suggested that the woman might have lost consciousness due to an overdose of medication. Given the absence of signs of an unauthorized person, the possibility of an accident was also considered. After all, Stacy Feldman could have simply slipped on wet tiles or suffered a seizure. However, many people were convinced it wasn't an accident. The police officers were unaware that it would take a tremendous effort to prove the murder case. Stacy Feldman was born in Indiana, USA, in 1970. She was the third child in the family, with sisters named Elizabeth and Susan. The children grew up in a friendly environment surrounded by understanding and love. The sisters supported each other throughout their lives and always found understanding from their parents. When Stacy's older sister became pregnant and had a child, the younger sister moved in with her without being asked to help raise the child. At that time, the older sister was divorced and solely responsible for herself. The family member lived in another city, so this decision was rather adventurous. For this purpose, the younger sister traveled from Chicago to be closer to her niece and her mother. Despite the increased workload, Stacy didn't complain about life. The pursuit of her own family and love was not foreign to her. During one of her travels, she met a man named Robert Feldman in Montreal. The spark ignited between them, and the young couple began a relationship. However, they met secretly from the family and got married in Montreal without informing their relatives because they anticipated family disapproval. Stacy took her partner's last name. The wedding was a small private party attended only by their closest friends. Afterward, the two moved to Denver, Colorado. Despite the secrecy, their bond proved strong. And the relatives didn't find out about the marriage right away. In the 10 years they were together, the marriage produced 2 children. At the time of the tragic events described, Stacy was a respectable, loving mother and a faithful wife. She actively participated in community life and got along with everyone. She had no enemies who would wish her dead. However, she suffered from an illness that enlarged her heart, and she was forced to take medication. On the morning of March 1, 2015, Stacy felt ill after a party with friends the night before, so she stayed in bed since the morning. Her husband took the children to church school alone at around 8:30 a.m. The mother was supposed to pick up the children at noon and later go with a group of friends to a small local carnival. However, when no one came to pick up the children at noon, the teacher called Stacy, but she didn't answer the phone. So, the school called her husband, Robert. After a while, he came to pick up the children and took them himself. They went to the carnival together, expecting to meet Stacy there. At 4 p.m., they returned home. The husband later recalled that when he returned with the children, he heard water running upstairs. He decided to check on his wife because she didn't respond to his calls. Robert went upstairs, opened the bathroom door, and was shocked to find his wife dead in the water-filled bathtub. He immediately sent the children to the neighbors so they wouldn't see their mother in such a state. Robert then called 911 and reported finding his wife's lifeless body in the bathroom. During the emergency call, he was instructed on first aid measures. The man followed the instructions, pulling his wife's body out of the bathtub onto the floor, where he tried to revive her while talking to the specialist on the phone. When the paramedics arrived, they moved the victim to a neighboring bedroom, where they again attempted first aid, but it was too late. Stacy was pronounced dead at the scene around 4 p.m. Shortly after, police officers were called to the scene. The officers arrived within minutes and immediately began investigating the circumstances of the death. In the first few minutes, they suspected that the woman had not died without assistance. The bathroom was clean and tidy, with no signs of a struggle. It was even too clean, which was one of the first reasons for the investigators' concern. Although Robert dragged his wife's wet body onto the bathroom floor, there were no traces of water on the floor. It seemed as if Robert had cleaned thoroughly before the police arrived. The towels were neatly hung in the bathroom, and the toiletries were scattered on the shelf next to the bath. They managed to find a damp cloth used to wipe the floor, but why would someone waste precious time cleaning instead of helping? Despite the cleanliness and the absence of signs of a struggle, Stacy had clearly suffered multiple injuries. Numerous bruises and contusions were found on her body, but none could be the cause of death. They all seemed too minor to injure the woman. The investigators questioned Robert to determine the circumstances of his wife's last days. He stated that they had been at a party at a friend's house the day before her death, where Stacy had smoked marijuana, which is legal in that state. She had also consumed alcohol. Therefore, she felt unwell in the morning and stayed in bed while her husband took care of the children. Robert also mentioned his wife's health issues, including cardiovascular problems, an enlarged heart, and arthritis. To combat the discomfort, Stacy took fentanyl, prescribed by doctors. Numerous spots were found on her body, small bruises that could have come from a fall or attempts to revive the victim. Could the woman have died from taking too much of the medication or losing balance and suffering an unfortunate fall? According to the police, only an autopsy could answer this question. In the meantime, the investigators discovered several other suspicious facts. A watch encrusted with gold and silver was found on the woman's wrist, a piece of jewelry Stacy used to signify her high status in her business. Why, then, would she shower with it and risk damaging the valuable jewelry? Although Robert actively supported the police, he was immediately considered the main suspect. After all, spouse murders are not uncommon, and he had found his wife's body. Superficially, everything seemed plausible, but the widow's behavior was somewhat unsettling. The investigation contacted the emergency dispatchers to find out how Robert behaved during the call. According to experts, he was very anxious and in a state of shock. The man screamed into the phone, was nervous, and even cried when he talked about seeing his wife's body. He tried to follow the instructions to provide first aid, but the widow's state of shock hindered the process even more, said the phone dispatcher. Despite the police's suspicions, Robert received much support from family and friends. However, in his conversations with the investigators, he answered some questions evasively and couldn't remember some details of the incident. Even more bizarre was his desire to refuse an autopsy and bury his deceased wife as soon as possible. However, the suspicion of murder ruled out this option. So Stacy's body was sent for an autopsy and ended up on the coroner's table. After examining the body, the expert could not determine the exact cause of the woman's death. According to the expert, Stacy might have simply suffocated after losing consciousness in the bathtub. However, she had numerous bruises and abrasions, most of which could have been caused when she was pulled out of the tub for resuscitation. Some of the bruises on her body matched fingerprints that might have been left when someone held her down. To get to the bottom of the truth, the coroner had to conduct further analyses and examine the victim's body more closely. More specialists were expected to deal with the case, delaying the investigation significantly and making the work of law enforcement more difficult. At this point, they had no evidence to point to the perpetrator. The toxicological examination found various drugs in her body, but they were all prescription medications the woman had taken on a doctor's advice. More importantly, no traces of alcohol or substances were found in her bloodstream that should have remained after consuming alcohol with friends the night before. This indicated that Robert had lied. This fact was the first conclusive evidence of his deception. Others followed later. The next discrepancies in the widow's statements were discovered after talking to the head and staff of the church school where the couple's children attended. The teacher claimed that it was not the parents but a family friend who was supposed to pick up the children. This was stated by the father himself when he received a call around noon. This was the second contradiction, as Robert convinced the police that it was the wife who was supposed to pick up the schoolchildren. It turned out that the man knew in advance that this was impossible and warned the teacher that another familiar person would pick up the children. Since this person did not show up, the teacher called Stacy and Robert. The man was very late, arriving only around 1 p.m. He postponed the pickup time for the schoolchildren several times. The father said his friend was busy and would come as soon as he was free. Stacy couldn't respond at that time because she wasn't home. Could the main suspect have used this time to clean up the traces of violence in his house? According to the teachers at the church school, Robert looked quite strange when he arrived. Despite the cool weather, he wore shorts and a t-shirt and seemed very irritated and excited, which was unusual for him. On normal days, he was always calm and reasonable. To delve deeper into this tangled case, the investigators requested recordings of the emergency call made by the main suspect. They wanted to find evidence or inconsistencies in the statements that could allow them to bring the man to justice. When the investigators listened to the call, they heard a toilet flush in the background. They suspected that the perpetrator might have been disposing of evidence at that time. They also heard no confirmation that the widower tried to administer first aid to his wife. He was explained how to perform CPR, but he repeatedly agreed with the operator without background noise or the heavy breathing typical of such actions. It seemed that the husband neither provided first aid nor tried to save his wife, probably because he was sure of her death and desired a tragic outcome. Gradually, a likely motive emerged. As the sole beneficiary of a life insurance policy, Robert could expect a substantial sum of $750,000 in the event of her death. The investigators then turned to Robert again. The police tried to determine why he lied about his wife's consumption of alcohol and other substances the day before her death. The investigators were also interested in the spots on her body that, although they appeared as if she had been pulled from the bathtub and given first aid, still looked suspicious. There was still the possibility that the bruises occurred during Stacy's struggle for her own life. The investigator examining the crime called Robert to discuss some of the points the coroner had identified. At the same time, the investigator wanted to ask some tricky questions that could lead the murderer to the truth. First, the investigator wanted to know how his wife had been lying, face up or face down, when he found her in the bathroom. The man couldn't remember these details. He immediately began to explain that he was in shock when he discovered his wife's body, losing his speech and memory. According to the widower, he immediately tried to pull her out of the bath, quickly and with all his might, perhaps not carefully because it was an emergency, causing bruises. It's known that a person who is unconscious is quite heavy, making it difficult to handle a breathless body, even for a strong man. This way, Robert tried to justify the appearance of bruises on his wife's body. However, the investigators did not receive concrete answers to their questions. They were then confronted with contradictory statements from the widower himself and his acquaintances. Initially, the family man claimed he was not at home because he left at 8:30 a.m. to take the children to school and returned only at 3 p.m. later. Witnesses reported seeing Robert at home that fateful morning. According to the man, he should have come by the house around noon to walk his dog. Could Robert have killed his wife during this time? It was also unclear how much time the man had spent in the house. It was possible that he had only used the time when the children's teachers tried to contact him to erase the traces of his crime. Thus, the main suspect's statement changed again. According to Robert, he took the children to the church school and stayed there for a short service. Then he went to training and changed at home afterward. At that time, the widower did not see his wife and stayed about 20 minutes, not disturbing her because he thought she was still resting after the previous night's party. The man also said he hadn't heard any water noises in the bathroom. The main suspect's statements did not convince the investigators. Robert described the events of the last few months in detail, but nothing seemed unusual. The police decided to see how he reacted by mentioning the questionable autopsy results. The widower claimed he didn't know what could have happened to his wife but believed she might have fainted for health reasons and simply drowned in the water. Again, nothing suspicious could be detected, but the police officers were ready to go to the limit. In fact, the only problem the coroner identified was a kidney condition that caused her kidneys not to function properly. The coroner could not identify any injuries that could have caused her death. The investigation stalled for 4 months. Finally, the Denver Police Department received new information confirming the suspicion that Robert Feldman was involved in his wife's death. The information came from an unexpected source, a woman who did not know Stacy. Her name was Susan McBride. According to the informant, she met a man on Tinder in 2015 named Robert Wolf, who claimed to be a meat dealer from Denver. The new witness said they began an online relationship that led to a single date. Although Robert described himself as divorced, Susan found out he was not who he claimed to be. Since she wanted to continue the relationship, she investigated Robert's personal data and found that Robert Feldman, a married man, was behind this name. She decided to email Stacy to accuse her husband of cheating. This message was discovered in the victim's personal records. Surprisingly, it was sent at 6:20 p.m. on March 1st, just a few hours before Stacy's death. The women exchanged brief messages and decided to call each other. A short phone conversation between them ended at 9 a.m. They parted on friendly terms. Stacy thanked Susan and promised to end her relationship with her cheating partner. After that, they didn't contact each other again. Susan continued to look for relationships online. 3 months later, she had another unsuccessful date. During this time, she remembered Stacy and wondered how her relationship with her partner ended. However, instead of finding the divorced woman online, she stumbled upon an obituary. She then inquired about the details of the crime that had occurred. She discovered that the murder was probably still unsolved. The obituary did not mention Stacy Feldman's cause of death. Everything seemed more than suspicious. A woman who received evidence of her husband's infidelity and whose life was insured for $750,000 died the morning she decided to end the marriage. Of course, the police did not consider this a coincidence. In October 2017, the Denver police brought in an independent pathologist, a renowned specialist in strangulation cases. After a reanalysis of the victim's body, the new expert could prove that she had died a violent death. It happened in the morning between 10 and 12 o'clock. The last text message from her phone was sent at 9:59 a.m., after which she was no longer able to pick up her children from school. According to the police, Robert visited her at that time, and an argument ensued. In a fit of rage, he strangled his wife and later made it look like an accident. It turned out that the previous coroner who conducted the autopsy had not done his job properly. He had overlooked a number of important pieces of evidence and had not conducted a complete autopsy. For the involved independent expert, the murder was obvious. In February 2018, Robert Feldman was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty and, in the absence of direct evidence, was placed under house arrest on a $1 million bail. However, this did not lead to a fair verdict. The justice system was stalled again and moved very slowly. Hearings in this case were postponed no less than 6 times. During the same period, the victim's family fought with the man over the inheritance. Thanks to the insurance payout, he could hire top-notch lawyers who were among the best experts in criminal cases, for which he paid more than $550,000. However, a probate attorney in Denver prevented Robert from using the money. Money from a criminally obtained insurance policy cannot be used for defense in court. Therefore, the widower had to rely on a public defender. He lost the case but subsequently appealed to the state Supreme Court. He won this procedure because the money he received was deemed legal. As a result, the accounts were unblocked, and the man could use the money in full. In the spring of 2020, he hired a new expensive lawyer who was even better prepared for such cases. The trial in this case was scheduled for April 2020. During this time, the defender secured bail for him. Robert was to remain under house arrest and could only leave the house for serious reasons, such as seeing a doctor. His defender was supposed to handle the delivery of groceries and all necessities. However, the suspect moved freely around the city and covered hundreds of miles on his bicycle. Due to the pandemic, the hearing was postponed again. During this time, Robert continued his normal life as if nothing had happened. The victim's family was shocked by what was happening. They sat back and waited for justice under the pressure of the closure orders. Meanwhile, the murderer roamed free and had nothing to fear. The man was constantly on his bike and registered multiple accounts under different names on dating sites. The widower enjoyed his life, meeting other women, and clearly had no intention of going to jail. It is known that he dated at least 5 women while under house arrest. One of them came home for a date and later decided to notify the police. The woman reported that she intuitively felt threatened throughout the encounter but didn't know what it was about and ignored her intuition. However, when they were near the pool in the backyard, Robert attacked and raped her. She initially decided not to report it to the police but became interested in the story of Robert Wolf, who her new friend claimed to be. She managed to find out his real name and surname and also learned that the man might be involved in his wife's death. After that, she had no more doubts, and the victim of a rapist and murderer turned to the Denver police. The investigation, which lasted more than 3 years, finally gathered all the evidence required for an indictment. Several important witnesses also came forward, helping uncover the crime. However, even at this stage, the hearings were repeatedly postponed. Finally, they began in April 2022. Robert Feldman was accused of intentionally murdering his wife. The prosecution presented solid evidence that the man had long been beating his wife, but the cause of death was strangulation. The defense insisted it was an accident in the husband's absence. The woman had an enlarged heart due to illness and suffered a seizure, causing her to faint in the full bathtub. Since she could not free herself and no one was there to help, Stacy simply drowned. The blood stains found in the bathtub upon closer inspection were minor and attributed to her period. The trial lasted 9 days, after which the jury deliberated for nearly 3 hours. The result was a unanimous decision, and Robert was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, and all his appeals were rejected. Thank you for watching, and take care.